coming up on Secrets of the Dead. In 1910, Dr. Hawley Crippen was accused of poisoning and dismembering his wife.
It was the O.J. Simpson case of 1910, media-driven frenzy.
Crippen was tried and executed. A century later, can modern forensics prove he was innocent?
When you examine the DNA evidence, we've got to consider the case in a wholly different light.
It throws all the evidence from the trial, it throws it in the trash.
Executed in error on Secrets of the Dead. Secrets of the Dead was made possible by contributions to your PBS station from viewers like you. Thank you.
You will be hanged by the neck.
In 1910, an American doctor named Hawley Crippen was convicted in England of poisoning and dismembering his wife. The vicious murder and execution that followed made international headlines.
What was there was a mass of flesh. No head, no arms, no legs.
100 years later, investigators have reopened the files on a murder which became known as one of the crimes of the century. It was a landmark case, the first trial by media, and the first to be dominated by forensic science. But did the jury get it right, or was Crippen hanged for a crime he didn't commit? Recently declassified case files and a new analysis of DNA evidence from the crime scene are casting some serious doubts.
We tested it and tested it and tested it.
Oh, boy. I'm running scenarios through my mind of planted evidence.
Can a modern forensic investigation rewrite one of the most important cases in criminal history? The gruesome body parts were found in a shallow grave inside a suburban home. The address was 39 Hilldrop Crescent in London's Camden Town. The men who made the discovery, hardened detectives, were horrified by the find. They reported that the victim had been poisoned and then filleted like a side of beef. News of the killing spread fast. Fearful Londoners were instantly reminded of Jack the Ripper, who had terrorized the city only 2 decades earlier. This murder was as horrific as anything the Ripper had carried out. But the prime suspect hardly fit the profile of a violent offender. He was a mild-mannered gentleman, a quiet doctor living in suburbia. Yet despite his demure appearance, there he stood, accused of killing his own wife and slicing her to pieces. The heinous crime captivated the world.
The ghastly and wicked nature of the crime, I will not dwell.
To this day, Crippen's wax likeness stands in infamy in London's Chamber of Horrors. It was an open and shut case. Capture, conviction, execution. But now, a century later, forensic toxicologist John Trestrail and other experts are questioning the case, putting the evidence of the prosecutors back on trial.
Hello, sir. Morning. I need to go to Hilldrop Crescent in Camden.
Trestrail is an expert on poisoning. His textbook on the subject is used by the FBI. From the first time he studied the Crippen case, something about the description of the crime made him uncomfortable.
The thing that keeps me coming back to this Crippen case is the dismemberment of the body. It does not make sense to dismember one's victim. This is the only case I know of where the victim was dismembered. A poisoner attempts to get a natural death certificate signed and walk away from the crime.
This glaring incongruity sparked Trestrail's curiosity. So 9 years ago, he set out to re-examine all the known evidence from the case. Hawley Crippen was born in Coldwater, Michigan. He arrived in London in 1897, selling homeopathic patent medicines. Homeopathy had just caught on in England, and Crippen was capitalizing on the trend.
He was making the sum of $220,000 in today's dollars. That's a lot of money for selling patent medicine.
Hawley and his wife Cora rented an apartment in London's upscale Bloomsbury district. Although Cora had followed Hawley to London, there were clear signs that their marriage was not a happy one. Cora was born in Brooklyn and was only 19 when she married Hawley, who was 12 years her senior. They had very different temperaments and interests, and seemingly little in common.
She was very showy, very flamboyant and flirtatious. Hawley, on the other hand, very quiet, non-confrontational, just a complete opposite in the marriage.
While Hawley built his homeopathy business, Cora struggled to launch a career as a vaudeville singer. She dreamed of seeing her name in lights, but she had little talent and never managed to achieve much success. Cora's career floundered in second-rate theaters. Then, in 1905, homeopathy suddenly fell out of fashion, and Hawley's comfortable income plummeted. The Crippens were forced to move down market. They traded their fancy Bloomsbury apartment for a modest rental in rundown Camden. It is here that John Trestrail has come to start piecing together the many details of the 100-year-old crime. He hopes a careful analysis of the court records and advanced forensic testing on the physical evidence from the crime scene can shed new light on the body and the conviction. The trial transcript is a useful starting point. It reveals Crippen's version of the chain of events leading up to Cora's disappearance in January of 1910.
Cora was drinking heavily. She'd been known to have an affair. He went to work, came home, and she was gone. That's what he claimed in court. They had a fight. She says, "I'm leaving you. I will never be back. You will never find me."
In February, Crippen wrote to Cora's friends, telling them she was visiting relatives in America. 6 weeks later, he wrote again to say that Cora had come down with pneumonia.
And they said, "Oh, that's terrible. Keep us posted." He said, "Okay," later on. She died in America.
For a husband who should have been in mourning, Crippen seemed remarkably indifferent. And there was good reason. The 47-year-old doctor, so outwardly respectable, was having an affair with his 26-year-old secretary, Ethel Leneve.
Ethel and Hawley had an affair for at least 3 years before Cora Crippen disappears. She was young enough to be his daughter, actually. She was quiet, demure. She gave him the emotional love Cora could not.
With Cora gone, Ethel and Crippen lived comfortably at Hilldrop Crescent for 6 months. Then, on Friday, the 8th of July, they received a visitor. At the urging of Cora's friends, Scotland Yard's Chief Inspector Walter Dew had come to investigate Cora's disappearance. 20 years earlier, Dew had been involved in the unsuccessful hunt for Jack the Ripper.
Cora's friends took their concerns to Scotland Yard and said, "We're a little suspicious. Our friend has disappeared. Her husband said that she's dead in America. We can find no proof of that. We would like you to look into it."
I haven't seen her since then.
When questioned, Crippen revealed that he hadn't been honest with Cora's friends. He said that Cora had left him for another man, that he'd invented the story of her illness to save face.
Threatened to do.
Claiming he had nothing to hide, he showed the officers around the house. He even took them to the coal cellar. Everything seemed to be in order, so the officers returned to Scotland Yard.
On Monday, Inspector Dew shows up to ask Crippen some more questions and finds the premises vacant.
This was an unexpected turn of events after Crippen's explanation the previous Friday. Dew immediately began a more thorough search of the empty house.
He happens to pry up one of the stones in the floor of the coal cellar. Pokes down 4 or 5 inches. They find decomposing stuff. It's not a body in here, it's pieces. It's stomach and tissue and hair and some clothes, and it's just a mess. They probably hadn't seen stuff like that since the Ripper was at work.
But unlike with the Ripper, this time they had a plausible suspect. Within days, news of the crime was splashed across headlines around the world. And police and citizens alike were hunting for Crippen and his lover. Amid hundreds of mistaken sightings, Scotland Yard received a message from the captain of an ocean liner in the Atlantic.
Have strong suspicion that Crippen and accomplice are among passengers.
Captain Henry Kendall had seen the wanted poster before he sailed. Something about 2 of his passengers, a Mr. Robinson and his teenage son, aroused the captain's suspicions. Why didn't the youngster's clothes fit properly? And why was he forever clutching his father's hand?
Mustache shaved off. Accomplice dressed as a boy.
Kendall was sure he had the wanted couple. He snapped this photo, with Ethel on the left in her ill-fitting clothes. Kendall's ship, the Montrose, was one of only a few in the world fitted with a brand new Marconi wireless. Had the ship not carried this wonder of modern technology, Crippen would likely have escaped. Chief Inspector Dew boarded a faster ship, the Laurentic. He had to intercept the Montrose before she reached Canada. The chase was on, and the world was watching.
I don't think any murder in history had been covered that much by the newspapers. It was being read about all over the world.
Captain Kendall struck a deal with the papers. He kept close watch on the couple and sent updates every few hours.
The Crippen case, it was the O.J. Simpson case of 1910. We have the news media following this white Bronco as it's going down the highway. It's the same thing, media-driven frenzy on both of these cases.
Unbeknown to the fugitives, they were now world famous. The papers even reported what book Crippen was reading, a thriller called The 4 Just Men, about a London murder.
Hawley and Ethel are the last to know what's going on. The whole world's watching, waiting, anticipating.
The Laurentic finally caught up to the Montrose, and both liners dropped anchor off the coast of Quebec. Dew boarded and quickly apprehended Crippen and Leneve. For readers around the world, Crippen's arrest was the cliffhanger of a gripping soap opera. The next installment came in London's Central Criminal Court, where Crippen went on trial for his life. 4,000 people applied for 80 courtroom seats. On Tuesday, the 18th of October, 1910, the trial began. The crowds came for the spectacle and scandal, but they were also exposed to an unfamiliar new term, forensic science. Nobody had seen Crippen kill Cora, and he hadn't confessed. So the prosecution had to build their entire case around what was found in the coal cellar. But there was no head or fingerprints to identify the body, just some skin and internal organs, some strands of hair, and a few scraps of cloth. At first glance, there seemed little to prove that these putrefied remains had belonged to Cora. As he had previously stated, Crippen claimed Cora had run off with a lover, and that he had fled because he panicked after the visit from the police. He also said he knew nothing about the remains in the cellar, or how they had gotten there. Crippen's lawyers said there wasn't enough evidence to convict. But then, the prosecution produced their star witness, forensic pathologist Bernard Spilsbury. This charismatic young scientist, with a trademark red carnation in his lapel, dazzled the jury. What Spilsbury did was radical and new. He used forensics to offset the perceived lack of incriminating evidence. He claimed that the skin segment from the cellar contained a distinctive scar listed in Cora's medical records. The jury also heard how cloth fragments found with the remains matched a pair of Crippen's pajamas. And the remains were also said to contain a rare poison that Crippen was known to have had in his possession. With such powerful scientific testimony, the verdict came quickly.
Hawley Crippen.
The jury was out 27 minutes, and they walked back in and said, guilty.
You cruelly poisoned your wife?
The fledgling use of forensic science had triumphed, and Crippen was sentenced to death. The hanging would be at Pentonville Prison, right around the corner from Hilldrop Crescent. Up until the end, Crippen protested his innocence in a series of letters to Ethel and Eve. She'd been found not guilty at a separate trial and campaigned in vain to save her lover's life.
Hawley is sentenced and is hanged 4 weeks later. Fast justice compared to today, 4 weeks. That was all it took.
And that's how it stood for almost a century. An evil killer had been brought to justice. But John Trestrail wasn't satisfied with the results. The pieces just didn't add up.
I kept coming back saying, something's not right. Something's wrong in here we're not understanding. I have murdered and dismembered my wife and disposed of 99% of her body. Why do I leave 1% of it under the coal cellar? The most important question in this case was this really Cora Crippen or not?
Trestrail realized that today's advanced forensic techniques could provide far more information about a person's identity than the crude techniques of the 1900s. What they needed was DNA from the remains that they could test against DNA from a living relative of Cora Crippen. But all that DNA would not be easy to come by.
I wanted to look for records, though, was shipping records. I wanted
First,
to see for myself.
Trestrail enlisted Beth Wills, a Michigan-based genealogist who began the painstaking search for Cora's living relatives.
I was presented with Brooklyn in the 1880s, and that was a huge conglomerate of people, oftentimes many families living together, people who didn't want to be identified. So we had lots of problems.
Cora's case was particularly challenging. Before her marriage, she had called herself Cora Turner. At another time, as she tried to develop her stage career, she went by Belle Elmore. But she'd been born with the name Kunigunda Makamotski, to a Polish immigrant family who later changed their name to Mersinger.
I was posting messages on any and all genealogy message boards that I could find. Please, please, does this name mean anything to anybody? And I did get a wonderful email message back from a gal who said, My dad, he has a picture of Cora in his box of treasures that he keeps up in his closet. He remembers hearing about the murder and about the hanging, and this is my family.
Marie Hamill, a grandmother living in Santa Clarita, California, is the great-niece of Cora Crippen.
Look at this picture that she sent, and this is a picture of Marie and her mother, and look at the resemblance in the face between Marie's mom and Cora. It's unbelievable. They have an identical facial structure. It's amazing.
Beth Wills had found a living descendant to provide the modern DNA. The next priority was to track down some of the original forensic evidence that was presented at Crippen's trial. Scotland Yard still holds some of the trial exhibits, bits of hair and cloth in a museum. But they weren't prepared to send them to the United States for testing. Remarkably, even after all this time, there was another source. The Royal London Hospital had retained a set of pathological specimens for historical purposes.
I mean, that's the key to the project. Something to match or not match against Cora's DNA.
And these particular ones...
These microscope slides, prepared by pathologist Bernard Spilsbury before the original trial, contain actual pieces of skin from the remains in the cellar. They're one of the crucial pieces of evidence that hanged Crippen, and exactly what the modern DNA experts need. The samples are sent to the Forensic Biology Unit at Michigan State University, one of America's leading forensic DNA research labs.
Down here is just background.
Lab director Dr. David Ferran has worked on a number of high-profile cases, including that of the Boston Strangler. His team would now begin a complicated and time-consuming series of tests on the 1910 remains. A single microscope slide would provide more than enough tissue. But after 100 years, could viable DNA be extracted?
The tissue had been processed quite a bit back then, which isn't helpful to us. On the other hand, it had been stored in a museum. And if we compare that to bones that have been buried in the ground for 100 years, this was much better than that type of material.
What the team needs is mitochondrial DNA, which passes from mother to child via the egg. Unlike nuclear DNA, it's not diluted over generations, so if the sample from the cellar matches the modern samples, it would be a good indication that the remains really were Cora's. Ferran had obtained DNA from Marie Hamill, and as a further control, from her sister and daughter as well. What he was now looking for was any sign of mismatches in the genetic codes. And he found them.
Not just a single difference where we might say, well, that might have been a mutation that happened. We found a substantial number of differences which readily indicate that these are not maternally related.
Even one mismatch would have signaled that the remains had not come from Cora. The team found 5. With such huge implications, they decided to repeat all the tests.
I stepped back, waited a few weeks, and started over from scratch. Got new tissue, processed that again, compared that to the earlier DNA results. They were identical.
But Ferran had to consider another possible cause for the mismatch. Could the pathologist in 1910 have contaminated the sample with his own DNA?
Even though it's a very thin slice of tissue, there's a lot of material there from whoever's body that was. And if someone had touched that sample to process it, the amount of DNA that they would have left behind would be minuscule. DNA from tissue on the slide would have swamped out any material that may have been left by a pathologist.
I remember getting the call from David. He says, "Are you sitting down?" I said, "Yes." He says, "They don't match. It's not her." And I had this kind of real surreal feeling of, oh my God.
Just as it had a full century earlier, the Crippen case was once again making international news. In the small town of Coldwater, Michigan, the revelations from Dr. Ferran's lab were more than just headlines. They were personal. Back in the 1900s, the Crippens had been one of the wealthiest, most well-respected families in Coldwater, but their reputation had been tarnished by the murder. Now, Crippen's descendants saw an opportunity to exonerate their ancestor and clear the family name.
I am the closest living male relative. When you see the evidence that has turned up now, it was wrong to hang him. And that's why we're asking the British government for a pardon. The British government, in all honesty, owes it to us.
Based on the DNA results, a pardon seems justified, since Crippen was convicted of killing his wife. But if the remains weren't Cora's, whose were they?
What are these things doing there in the first place? How could they get there if it's not his wife? Then what are these things?
Trestrail thinks the answers may lie in the poison said to have been found in the remains. It was a little-known drug called hyoscine.
This is the only hyoscine murder case I'm familiar with. Most people have never heard of this drug at all. But it was used in obstetrics, abortion, obstetrical procedure. Ah, that makes sense.
When money got tight, could Crippen have turned to backroom abortions for extra cash? Records show he performed dental work on the side, so why not illegal abortions as well? Performing such procedures was dangerous business for doctors, who faced life sentences if caught. But with both a wife and a mistress to support, could Crippen have felt that was a necessary risk? In 1910, when all surgeries were dangerous, a botched abortion could easily have left an incriminating body to be disposed of. So is that where the body parts in the cellar had come from? Once again, David Ferran's team will try to find out. Their first test will be to establish the gender of the remains. Gender tests are simple with fresh DNA, but these old samples will require a special technique developed by his lab.
If you have a fresh sample, determining the sex of an individual is pretty straightforward. We do that in forensics all the time. It's when you have these less than optimal samples, old bones, in this case a preserved slide, where that gets much more difficult. The sexing assay that we're using is brand new, approximately 4,000 times more sensitive than the normal assay that we do in forensic laboratories.
What do we have here?
This is our female control.
It takes 2 weeks to complete the test cycle. When the data is compiled, John Trestrail is invited in to hear the results. Confirmation that the body was female would not prove Crippen had botched an abortion and disposed of the body, but it would indicate the theory was feasible.
As a result, this is a real-time assay, and those are the results from the slide DNA.
So that would be positively female.
This one? No, because you have 2 lines.
This is your area, not mine.
Female gives you 1 result.
What do we got?
This is an X and that's a Y.
So what does that mean?
It means it's male.
Oh my God.
And we've tested it multiple times.
We're not looking at the pathologist's DNA by any chance.
No, I'm confident of that. We tested it and tested it and tested it.
Oh boy.
So ideas?
Yeah.
I know you had some time to think about what males may be there.
God, you know, it almost, I'm running scenarios through my mind of planted evidence now. It certainly takes out the question of the abortion problem.
Yes, that does take out that one.
So we've closed that door.
Yes.
Then how do we explain Hyacin? Oh, man. It throws all the evidence from the trial that ultimately hanged Hawley Crippen. It throws it in the trash can. As far as that trial goes.
I agree.
Throws it in the trash.
Trestrail is not the only one shocked by the news.
Hi, David. Good. How are you?
Well, it's pretty interesting. Much to our surprise, it typed as male.
Oh, my gosh. That really, wow. That just kind of puts a whole new, wow.
It's not only, not Cora, but it's not even Cora's sex. It's male DNA.
Yes, that is so cool.
We managed to determine this.
For James Patrick Crippen, it's further confirmation of his ancestors' innocence.
Tissue on that slide is male in origin. It's not a female sample at all. It's definitely typed as male.
You have just made my day.
With clear evidence from David Ferran that the remains were not Cora's, and the abortion theory convincingly disproved, Trestrail begins to explore another possibility, that Crippen may have been framed. He's on his way to consult Andrew Rose, a legal expert who has made a special study of the Crippen case. Rose is an experienced defense barrister and should be able to provide some insights into the legal aspects of the case.
When you examine the DNA evidence, then that's pretty strong stuff. We've got to consider the case in a wholly different light.
Crippen testified that the remains must have been there before he moved into the house, perhaps from an earlier crime by a previous tenant. He told the court that he and Cora had only been at Hilltop Crescent since 1905. That date and a piece of blood-stained cloth would quickly come back to haunt him. Tangled in the rotting remains, police said they found pieces of a pajama shirt. An officer also testified that upstairs with Crippen's clothes, he found matching pajama pants. This was the smoking gun the police needed, a direct link between Crippen and the remains. But there was more. The cloth bore a label indicating where it was from, a store called Jones Brothers.
The pajama bottom were examined by a representative of Jones Brothers together with the remains of the top, and he'd formed a view from the type of cloth used that it could only have been acquired by Jones Brothers around about the end of 1908.
That meant that if the pajamas and remains had been placed in the cellar at the same time, they couldn't have been there prior to Crippen's arrival in 1905.
They say that this convicted him. What do you think? How bad was this evidence?
It was serious evidence against Crippen. There was, of course, the evidence of the scar, which was of great importance.
So the scar proved the who.
Absolutely.
And the pajamas proved the when.
That was the idea.
The scar Rose is referring to was one of the most damning pieces of evidence presented by the prosecution. Forensic pathologist Bernard Spilsbury claimed it was on a piece of skin from the abdomen, and consistent with an operation Cora Crippen was known to have undergone 15 years earlier.
He said, "I have no doubt that it is scar tissue." He repeated that, and his evidence obviously had a remarkable impact. Without this evidence, Crippen might well have walked free from court.
Crippen's lawyers argued it wasn't a scar at all, just a mark where the skin had been folded. The notes from the defense's expert witness still exist.
He's seeing sebaceous glands, which are like sweat glands. He's seeing hair follicles, and we know that that's not consistent with scar tissue. You don't have those in scar tissue, and so what he's trying to say to the jury is, I don't think this is a scar. I think it's a fold in the skin, that's all it is.
After his modern-day perusal of the tissue, David Ferran agrees with the defense.
There are several slides at the museum. 3 or 4 of those represent the so-called scar. Other ones represent what are labeled as folds in the skin. Visually, I doubt that any of us could look at those and differentiate them. So it seems quite possible that Dr. Spilsbury found what he wanted to find.
Unfortunately for Crippen, the jury found Spilsbury's conclusion about the scar more convincing than the defense experts' folded skin theory. But for Rose and Trestrail, there is something a little too convenient about the evidence that was presented. No body, but a piece of skin with a recognizable scar, and just enough fabric to tie Crippen to the crime.
It's a remarkable feature of the Crippen case that the remains should have been found in the way that they were alleged to have been deposited. It's extraordinary. If I were defending Crippen, I would make great play on the fact that the alleged murderer had disposed of large quantities of the body in some other way, and yet left a filleted section in his own house. A very strange thing to do, to leave incriminating material together, of course, with items of your own clothing.
If we understand what's not in this grave, he had to be hauling body parts somewhere in town into a canal or somewhere to get rid of it. A head, his wife's head, etc., limbs. And these